Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well as we gather together again for some more Bible study. But before we do that, we're going to pray. We're going to take a minute, and this week's our prayer focus was for Chi Alpha missionaries. I know we were able to host Kent Chi Alpha here this past weekend, I guess yesterday and Friday, as they prepare for school. So let's go to God. Father God, we come before you, Lord. We thank you for today. God, we commit our service to you. Lord, we want to lift up the various missionaries and ministries at the college campuses that you've placed, not Chi Alpha being like for the Assemblies of God, but also all of the other ones. I think of like Campus Focus and H2O at the University of Akron and some of the other programs that exist. God, as students from around the world flock to our campuses, God, many with various expectations that may not be aligned with your heart. God, like we pray that you would let this be fertile soil to speak the gospel and the good news and truth of like your kingdom being here and inaugurated and manifest in the lives of your church, God. So we pray encouragement and wisdom and discernment and peace over the missionaries that you've called to serve those communities. And then, God, we commit our service to you, Lord, that our hearts would be open to hear what you would speak, God, that we would see and know your goodness in the midst of this all. And we commit it all up to you, Lord, in your holy, precious name. Amen. So we are starting a new Bible study tonight. And it's been like 6 months since we've gone through a book of the Bible, right? We finished the Minor Prophets, and then after that we did like 16 fundamental truths and doctrine, and then we did the Ask the Pastor, which were great things to talk about, and they were great, but we're gonna start our next book, which is the Book of Judges. The hope is to take about 12 weeks to go through the Book of Judges, and we'll see how that happens. Originally, when we went into the Minor Prophets, I thought we were going to be done in 7 months, and 15 months later we finished. But just like with the Minor Prophets, right? Our purpose is to have Berean hearts that search the Scripture to discern and understand truth, and then to ask questions and answer questions. Like the questions being, what does the passage say about God's ways, His heart, and His character? And then how is the text useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work, as Paul writes in Timothy. So let's talk about the Book of Judges. And you may say, Chris, why the Book of Judges? Well, it's because the Book of Judges, it is a difficult book. Not necessarily difficult in some of its nuance. Honestly, it's difficult to see where God is in this book sometimes. And you may say, Chris, how can you say that? Well, the last 5 chapters of this book, the main storyline is a Levite priest. His concubine gets raped, and so her body gets cut up and shipped throughout the realm of Israel, so then go wage war, and that's like the sign and call for war. And you're like, that sounds really weird. Well, I didn't make up the story. It's in the Book of Judges, and we're going to get there. And it's hard to, as you read these things, understand why did God include them. So we're going to kind of go through these stories about very imperfect human beings and how they have... Yeah, we'll get there. I chose it because it's hard. And I really felt compelled to we have to lean into hard texts. It's easier to just read through it and oh, that's a little weird, and then move on. But we want to understand where God is in the midst of all of this. So we're doing intro just like we did with all the other books. We're going to do an intro outlining the overall narrative of the book, information about it, and then we're going to go through. So today the hope is to get through chapter 1. First, we need to understand where Judges is placed in the Bible, right? Where it is in the Old Testament. And what you may not know is that the Hebrew Bible is arranged slightly differently than the Christian Bible. So the Hebrew Bible, it's called the Tanakh. That's all of the different books, the law, the prophets, and the writings all mixed together. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's very strategically placed. So you have the law, and then you have the prophets, and Judges is considered one of the prophets, one of the former prophets. And so the way the Bible is set out is you have and the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings. So the narrative history of Israel. And then you're followed by the later prophets, which are what we would consider the major and minor prophets. And the way the Hebrew Bible is written is, here's the law, and then you have the former prophets, what we would call historical books, that say, here's how Israel failed to keep the law. And then you have the later prophets, which is, and here's what God spoke about Israel failing to keep the law and the promises going forward. So it's very strategically placed in there. Like, this is part of the narrative, not only of how Israel was formed as a nation, but how Israel failed to live up to the covenant in Sinai. Like, this sets up the established realities of Israel failing to maintain the law as God laid out in Sinai. And as they deviated from Moses as king, priest, and prophet, and like singular leader with God as the Lord and Moses being like the in-between, or like the high priest there, to the point that where we end up. Like, it's a domino in the line that brings us to the end of 2 Kings where they go into exile. But let's talk about more specifically. Judges comes right after Joshua. And that's not just because chronologically it happens next. When you look at these books, they're parallels. Joshua is about the entering of the promised land and the victory of God's people, the dedication of sites as they go and they make all of these good progresses. And then in Judges, it starts with Joshua stepping down from power. So Joshua begins with Joshua coming to power. Judges begins with Joshua stepping down from power. And it kind of undoes everything that happened in Joshua. So like all of the major milestones that occur in the book of Joshua, you see like it's like a mountain going and come back down, right? Peaks at the end of Joshua, peak Israel, right? And Judges shows the degradation that happens afterwards. I got a couple quotes from one of the commentaries I read. It shows that like Joshua starts with no Moses, no land, and a people threatening to divide between east and west, right? These are the tribes going back across the Jordan. Joshua ends with a unified people having conquered a land and proved the merits of its leader. And then the final part of Judges shows the need to start all over again, because at the end of Judges, there's no Moses, the land's not really had the way it was at the end of Joshua, and the people are divided. There's civil war at the end of Joshua. Excuse me, at the end of Judges. So the final book of Judges shows the need, the final part of Judges shows the need to start all over again under a new system. Families, religious sites, normal rules of hospitality, and intertribal cooperation and national unity have disappeared. So the thing that would make them a unified people, that they just spent 40 years in the wilderness becoming a people and then conquering Canaan together as a people, it's all kind of being undone. The covenant established at the end of Joshua is immediately broken at the beginning of Judges. The tribal cooperation of Joshua 1 reverts to civil war, 2 tribes of Israel having been slaughtered, not fully eliminated, but very much so vanquished. A divinely appointed leader is no longer present. So Joshua begins with a divinely appointed leader. Judges begins with not really a divinely appointed leader, and certainly there being no leader at the end of Judges. At the beginning of Judges and in Joshua, you have female heroes who are present there, whether that's Rahab or Deborah. But by the end of Judges, you have those female heroes have been replaced with female rape victims, or they have been kidnapped. You have religious rituals which bring defeat rather than victory, whereas in Joshua and then early even in like the life of Gideon and the early Judges, religious rituals are manifested in the reality of victory, but ultimately you have them resulting in defeat at the end of Judges. Holy war aims at another Israelite tribe to secure wives for a decimated tribe rather than at the enemies as in Joshua's day. In Joshua's day, they waged war against the people God told them to drive out, but in the end of Judges, they have to wage war against each other. Judges has thus systematically destroyed all that Joshua created. And we'll talk about and we can say like why, but like why is it important for God to tell us these things? We'll get there, but it's just important understanding in the narrative, because you have, and we'll come back to this in just a second, right? It pictures enemies, so at the end of Judges, it pictures enemies already conquered by Joshua and Moses, or enemies who should have nothing at all to do with maintaining a hold on the promised land. It transforms Israel from being a united group of tribes overcoming potential east-west conflict into a group of small tribal alliances plagued by jealousy, internal strife, and finally near-fatal civil war. Judges explains only how Israelites hit rock bottom, not how they rose again to the top. It creates and sets the stage for the rise of the King of Israel as a means of unifying the people. But we'll come back to that in just a second when we talk about the authorship of the book. So let's structure that. Let's talk about the structure. How is Judges laid out? Judges is a series of short accounts that are not really connected necessarily. You have the stories of each of these judges, but they don't necessarily flow naturally from one to the other. It's not always that the end of like Samson's life clearly leads into the next judge's life. Whereas when you get into Kings and Chronicles, there's very clearly a pattern and an unbroken history in there. These are series of regional or localized heroes as they exist throughout Israel at this time, and we're hearing all their stories. It's a collection of stories, not necessarily one complete narrative. And they're organized in some complex ways. They might not be organized in chronological order. Like we read books chronologically because that's how we like to understand them, or they may sound like they appear in chronological order. But it might be that whoever compiled these narratives about each individual judges and put them into the Book of Judges arranged them instead to reflect theological truth than to reflect a chronological series of events. And you may say, well, and if they did that, that doesn't make them not true. That doesn't. Just like if you read a biography today, it doesn't always start and they were born on this date. Sometimes it tells events based on themes of time, not necessarily as they happened. And so I'll give you an example, right? Judges chapter 18, because you may say, Chris, I don't believe you. All right, well, cool. Well, we have to wrestle with some complexities. Well, maybe not you two, but other people here might be listening. So Judges chapter 18, verse 30. And it says that, and the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So at face value, this describes Moses' grandson. Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. Now you say, well, that might mean 500 years. Maybe, maybe not. But it doesn't tell us that. It tells us the grandson of Moses. But the events of Judges 19 are probably almost 300 years after the book of Joshua ends. Or if this is chronological, right, so that Judges 19 is at the end of the period of Judges, that's almost 300 years after Joshua, which is another 100 years after Moses. And Moses doesn't have a grandson alive 400 years after he was born. And you may say, well, it could just mean that he was like a descendant of Moses. All right, well, let's look at another example. Judges chapter 20, verse 28. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered for the ark of, 27 and 28. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days. Once again, we are, if this is chronological, at the very end of the 300-ish year period of Judges, and we see another grandson of Aaron, which is 400 years after the life of Aaron. Now, there could be, so like, is Phinehas the son of Aaron, or the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, is he still high priest 400 years later? Maybe. Or it is possible that these are arranged differently. And I'll give you a perhaps example that they are arranged, that the book is arranged geographically. that it begins with the discussion of the southern portion and judges in the south of Judah, and then it moves north and it ends in the northern tribes. That is one way that people read this. And so the tales of the judges, not the tales, but the accounts of the lives of the judges, it is more of a geographical progression, not necessarily which reflects a theology, not necessarily a chronological progression. That doesn't make it not true. But that's an interpretation that scholars hold. But ultimately, the question of why it is structured the way it is very complicated, and there's a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions on it. Yeah?
I have a footnote, and I just want some of the judges ruled concurrently, since each one did not necessarily rule over the entire land. So that's what you're talking about chronologically or geographically, and would that not cause confusion among the people?
Well, and so Pastor Dale brings up, like, one of the notes is that the judges may have ruled concurrently, not necessarily, because the judges were not necessarily ruling over all of Israel. They were not. It was not necessarily that Samson was judge over all Israel. He would have been the judge of the appointed leader of his region or his sphere of influence. And so it's possible that there's some overlap.
District judges here?
No, it would be more, like, honestly, the better, like, it might be almost more like a warlord. Like, they're not really a king over a whole region, or maybe like a tribal chieftain, kind of. And one of the questions or issues with that, one of the reasons why that's brought up is that there are timeline concerns. If you read all of the dates that are mentioned, so if you, I think it's in, I didn't write it down because I wasn't going to go in this, but we will because it's interesting. When you look at the years listed in Chronicles, when they talk about the time periods of events, like this number of years to this number of years, and this number of years from this event. So when they talk about the time of Joshua's death, or the time of the judges, from Joshua, I guess, to Saul, they give a set number of years in the Book of Chronicles that occurred. I think it's in Chronicles. I don't remember exactly where. I'll have to look it up because I didn't put it in my notes. But when you add together all the years listed in the Book of Judges, that is more years than that. Right? The Book of Judges, for example, I think it's something like, it says there's 400 years that it covers the span from Joshua to King Saul. But when you add all the dates and years that they mention in there, it's like 517 or something. And so it's, well, how can 517 equal 400? Well, one of the thoughts is that they rule concurrently over their different spheres of influence. So that's another way of looking at it. But really, when we look at, as we read through, like, why as we talk about this judge first, well, one of the theories is because we start with the judges of Judah and then we move north. And overall, Judah tends to look more positively in the Book of Judges. And the northern tribes, specifically Joseph's tribes, like Ephraim and Manasseh, mostly Ephraim, look very bad. And then also the tribe of Benjamin looks really bad in this book. But Judah is like the good tribe as we read it. And we'll get to that in a second. But anyway, so I want to read a quote for you about the structure of Judges. The Book of Judges is a literary masterpiece that is intentionally written against the grain. It's got violence, irony, uncouth acts, and comic relief. Its structure is geographical, literary, and theological rather than primarily historical or chronological. The framework gives us an interpretation to the stories that helps explain the entire history of Israel and that sets it in polar opposition to the framework and structure of Joshua. The stories themselves make known the reality of life before David. They contain elements that make heroes of the leading figures rather than making them ironic causes of Israel's decline, as the final collection does. These heroic elements lead to the inclusion of these figures in the roll call of faith in the letter to the Hebrews. So ultimately, the judges are held as heroes of the faith, and we do read about them as being like, we talk about them as being like good people, but ultimately, like, the judges' failures is what perpetuates the downfall of Israel. They failed as judges, which is why Israel continued to degrade and why ultimately they moved toward a king. So let's keep going. So two key themes, right? There's two major themes, right? First, Israel's spiritual and political decline, and then ultimately Yahweh's gracious and repeated deliverance from Israel. Or better describe it, the purpose of Judges is it's a literary unit describing the deterioration of Israel's society, politically, morally, and religiously. So let's talk about dating, because we want to understand when it was written, and when it was written matters a lot. There's a number of theories, but one of the theories, the two that we're really going to look at and that we're going to kind of hold in balance to each other is that it was compiled. Like, why was this book written? And it was written, but ultimately we have these events that exist in oral history for Israel, the stories of Gideon and Samson and Deborah and all of these other judges. But why were they written down? Why did Israel need to have this in writing? Because it had to have been written down by someone, or at least edited by someone after it was all said and done. Like, there wasn't one scroll that got passed through Israel, and after Samson's life they wrote it, and then they passed it to whoever was Gideon's scribe, and then they wrote Gideon's life. Like, someone took these events and compiled them into a book. And there's two time frames we're going to look at. The first was early in David's reign, when there was a dispute still between Saul's descendants and David's ascendancy to kingship. And the second one was, the second time frame for potentially being written is at or slightly before or after the split between the kingdoms of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So just after Solomon dies and the kingdoms of northern Israel and Judah split. And so why are these the dates that we want to look at? Well, so much of the focus of Judges is on the need for a king. And there was no king in those days. Like, that's a refrain that happens all these times. They did what was right in their own eyes, and there was no king in those days. And so the Book of Judges in many ways is very much a call to align under the right leader, the right king. And so in both of these times, in David and Saul's descendants, or Jeroboam and Rehoboam, like, there is the question of, do we align under Judah or under these other tribes? Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamin gets a very bad rap in this book. Rehoboam, I don't remember exactly which tribe he was from. I think it was from Ephraim, but Ephraim gets a really bad rap in this. Locations that that I'm sure we remember talking about, like Dan and Samaria and Bethel, and places that when we were reading the minor prophets that the northern kingdom used as pagan worship, or I guess as non-Jerusalem worship sites, get critiqued in the text. But Judah is generally held as the good guy. So it seems that the writer of this book is trying to say, hey, you should align under Judah, not under Ephraim and Benjamin and Dan and these other bad guys that didn't get it, and look at what they failed with. And at these two times in Israelite history, we see this conflict. David of Judah versus I think it's Mephibosheth, like Saul's son, who's from the tribe of Benjamin. Or you have Jeroboam and Rehoboam, like the descendant of Solomon versus the northerner who decides he wants to be king. So it was Jeroboam that was the northern one, not Rehoboam. Jeroboam, the Ephraimite. So ultimately this book is being potentially written, or we're going to pursue that as being written and published at a time when there are northern king claims, whether it's under the descendants of Saul or of Jeroboam the Ephraimite, to lead the northern tribes away from the south. And we also see that at the time judgment on Bethel and Dan becomes clearest, right? And then even Benjamin. So the hypothesis we're working with when this was written is somewhere around 1000, which is when David was born, or David was king, and early in his ascendancy, so 1050 to 1000, or about 100 years later, about 1150, when you start seeing the split, not 1150, 950, when you see the split of the kingdoms. When these two times when northern claims are trying to compete, and every tribe and every person in Israel has to decide, who am I going to follow? Am I going to follow Judah, God's anointed and God's appointed, or am I going to follow this northern king? And it gets, I will go through a number of times and looking at different things, right? Because the writer of Judges very clearly puts Judah as the primary, the good guy among the tribes, the only successful of the tribes. They condemn cities and locations like Bethel and Dan, the entire northern kingdom, because of idolatrous worship, which is ultimately what happens later when the kingdoms split. So we're generally looking in those time frames, either right around the beginning of David's timeline or right around the rise of Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the split of the two kingdoms. That could be wrong. It could be another time. There's other theories, but that's what we're going to pursue. So let's talk about the purpose. And I have a bunch of quotes because they're really good. And then we're going to, so kind of going into why was this book written? What is the intent of the author to write this book?
Are you going to talk about the author of the book?
The author really depends on which theory we have for when it was written. It would seem that it was someone, if we accept that it was someone writing in favor of the kings of Judah, then it could have been Samuel writing it. If it was for David, it could have been another prophet or someone or an unknown scribe of the court. But no, I did not. Does your footnote say anything?
My footnotes just say that the Talmud suggests Samuel, but it's possible that he may have only written portions, and it could be various authors.
Yeah, and so the Talmud, which was the series of teachings that came out during the captivity, so like the Babylonian Talmud, they suggest that possibly Samuel wrote it, which would imply David's reign as the time it was written. But as I said, what we have here is not necessarily a singular cohesive storyline. It's a series of oral traditions, like retelling of events that have been put together into a book. And so when they're taking these what they know, it's hard for us because we don't have oral tradition in America nearly as much, but we do what we call it folklore, and I don't want to call it that. That's not really what's happening here. But yeah, they're taking stories as they exist and understood and are passed verbally from people, and they're coalescing them into a book as an overall editor of it. And so you may be compiling, or a compiler, if we don't like the word editor, because that sounds like we're changing the truth of it, but that's not what I mean. They're compiling the book and making it into one narrative. So anyways, the purpose of Judges. So I have a big old quote from one of the book commentaries I read, and it's because it's just good. So, most obviously, the book of Judges deals with leadership. Indeed, a crisis in leadership. The crisis occurs because Joshua and his generation did not properly train the next generation. This leads to an attempt to find tribal leadership rather than individual leadership. But this style of leadership proves ineffective in trying to settle the land's cities left unsettled by Joshua, as the various failures in chapter 1 demonstrate. Consequently, the people rely on individual tribal heroes who are effective to varying degrees in their lifetimes, but consistently fail to provide continuity and faithfulness to Yahweh. Second, Judges deals openly with obedience, for Israel does evil in God's eyes. Doing evil means forsaking Yahweh as God and serving the Canaanite gods called the Baals and Asherahs. The basis of all of Israel's political and social troubles is explained in the departing from the first of the Ten Commandments, right? So the first is showing that the success of Moses, right? We talk about disciple makers who make disciple makers who make disciple makers, like third and fourth generation. Moses trained Joshua, and then by the third generation, the people had failed to carry on the legacy of Moses's disciple making in Joshua. And we can try and blame whoever we want, whether it's Joshua's fault, I don't know. But ultimately, we have this failure to steward faithfulness to God over the centuries. Similarly, David to Solomon to after Solomon, we kind of have a similar parallel there. And then the second is that ultimately, they choose to worship other gods. just like God said in Deuteronomy, and Moses proclaiming to them before they go in the promised land, like, once you're there, don't be tempted to follow those other gods. And they're like, oh, that sounds like a great plan. And then they do. And then third, Judges deals with the political scene. Judah is placed at the head of the list as the only truly successful tribe in inhabiting its God-given territory. Judges does not picture Judah as a perfect example of faithfulness, but Judah is the least of the evils among the tribes and the one twice designated as God's chosen leader. This portrayal stands in contrast to the image of Benjamin, the tribe of Saul, Ephraim, the tribe of Jeroboam, and Dan, one of the worship sites of the northern tribes. 3 tribes thus receive the brunt of another's judgment in Judges. Benjamin could not take Jerusalem, could not hold on to Bethel in the face of, and could not hold on to Bethel in the face of Ephraim's strength. They acted with lust and violence against Micah's concubine, refused attempts at reconciliation, and suffered the consequences. Ephraim proved strong militarily but weak spiritually in its pride and its demand to be first. Ephraim's sanctuary in Bethel had all the proper accoutrements as a central sanctuary, but the decisions made there led to defeat and then to the decimation of a whole tribe of Israel and the people of Jabesh-Gilead. The major positive decision at Bethel was for Judah to take the lead. Dan became a servant to Canaanite or Amorite seamen, eventually losing its foothold in the foothills and having more to move far to the north. And so in doing so, it took over by force a private sanctuary with its idol, teraphim, and priest. Why these 3 tribes? Ephraim and Bethel became the center of the northern Israelite worship and political power. Dan and Bethel became the center of northern Israel's cult, and Benjamin was the home of Saul, the first king of Israel. The authors who collected the materials of Judges into the final book apparently wanted Judah to go first ahead of the shameful trio of Benjamin, Ephraim, and Dan. Like that seems to be the whole purpose in writing, and that purpose nests very well either at the beginning of David's reign or at the beginning of around when Jeroboam and Rehoboam split. So let's go. We're going to go through the book of Judges, right? The first section is going to be, it's chapters 1 and 2, and we're going to look at chapter 1 within that, but that's kind of like the first major section. So the way the book is broken down, it's generally your judge narratives. You have your major judges like Deborah and Barak, Gideon, Samson, and then you have minor judges who some of them only get a passing reference that this person judged Israel for this many years from this place, and you never hear anything about their time. But generally your breakdown is a major judge, minor judge, then a series of minor judges, and major judges, and a series of minor judges, and the progression seems to address a north to south route. So let's look at Judges chapter 1. This is the immediate aftermath of Joshua transferring leadership before we see the emergence of individual judges. This is kind of the in-between. So chapter 1, we'll read it in segments, but generally it describes the initial outcome of the conquest, and it describes the process from north to south. Well, here, we'll read Judges chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" And the Lord said, "Judah shall go. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted for me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will likewise go with you to the territory allotted for you." So Simeon went with him. So here we have the people pursuing and seeking a divinely appointed leader. And it's interesting, in Joshua 1, the very first, because we saw the parallels between Joshua and Judges, Joshua 1 begins with an individual person taking as the divinely appointed leader of Israel, Joshua. Whereas in Judges, you have a tribe, Judah, taking over as the divinely appointed lead. And Judah is the one that is selected, right? Because remember we said that we're pursuing this text as though with the understanding that it was written in an attempt to sway Israel to continue to fall under the king of Judah, whether that's David or Rehoboam. And so Judah here is the one selected, and they're going to go, and God says, go fight, and Judah's like, hey, Simeon, you want to come with me? And so one of the things to think about is that at this point, Judah is the most powerful tribe, or one of them. They have a ton of soldiers, and Simeon is generally one of the smallest tribes and one of the weakest tribes. So, like, Judah doesn't really need Simeon's help, but it's a part of like a kind of a I'll help you when you need it, but you're going to have to help me first. Like, I'm not just going to come help you for nothing, right? If you want us to come because you're the weaker tribe, we'll come to your aid, but you got to help us first. And so then we'll go through 4 through 7. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. And they found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off I used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. Well, they defeat a king, and it's kind of gross, right? They cut off his thumb and his big toe. And this guy says that like 70 kings under me I did this to, and we got to use that term king loosely. That may mean more like a tribal leader or like the head of a family. And he talks about them picking up scraps under his table, like that. That does not necessarily mean that they're all enslaved to him, but more perhaps that they have to pay homage to him. They had to engage in some act of subservience to him. I don't know the significance of thumbs and toes and why those had to get cut off. But that's maybe it's I'm off the cusp. I guess if you cut your thumb off, you can't grip a sword anymore. And then if you cut off toes, you lose your balance. So
I have
yeah, go ahead.
Part of it said the thumb is what you just said because they couldn't use a weapon.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that when they say 70, that they're referring to, just like you said, tribes or cities.
Yeah, it's not necessarily kingdoms, because like kings were very localized there. Like you might be the king of the village of Richfield or something, right? Like mayors maybe, like 70 mayors I have serving me, like, and that'd be like a governor or something. So maybe that's more of an equivalent what we have. Yeah. Right, so they go and they take Adoni-Bezek and they take him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And so one of the thoughts is that, and then verse 8, and the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Beautiful conquest, right? So the question is, like, well, first off, at this point, Jerusalem is not the center of worship. David hasn't made it the temple. Right now, probably Shechem is, and I think I have it later, Hebron is probably the most important place of worship now, prior to this, and then later, like places like Shechem and other places will, but Jerusalem is just another city right now. It's a fortified city. And they go in and they burn it. And something that we may not think about is that what this is saying, what they're saying without saying, is that Judah did what Joshua could not. Joshua went up against Jerusalem, and in Joshua 15:63 it says that under Israel, that a united Israel under Joshua was unable to drive out the Jebusites from Jerusalem. But here, not only was Judah with Simeon, only one section, able to drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem, they were able to sack the city and loot it. Right? So if we remember that this book written to elevate the kingship of Judah and the supremacy of Judah, and Judah as the rightful heir over the northern tribes, showing that Judah was able to surpass the success of Joshua was significant. Yes. You don't need to apologize. It's good.
When Joshua tried to sack the city, whatever, do you know the scriptures say that God was with him? Was he going under the direction of God? Because when I read the Lord said, Judah shall go up, behold, I have given the land into his hand. So it's like God is directing this battle was God behind Joshua?
So the question is, was God behind Joshua when he went up against Jerusalem? I don't know. I know Joshua, at the beginning of Joshua, God says, like, wherever you set your foot, I go before you. But we also know that, like, there were times when Joshua didn't rightly inquire of the Lord and they lost battles. I can't recall off the top of my head, but Joshua 15 is where you see that account. And you should be, we could look that up. So now Judges 1, 9, and 10. And afterward, so after they have looted and sacked the city of Jerusalem, and afterward the men of Judah went down to fight among the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb, and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. So Judah follows the same path that Joshua does. In Joshua 10, we see that Joshua does the same thing, right? He goes to fight the Canaanites in the lowland, in the Negeb, and then he goes to Hebron, and then he fights against, like, these same three people or these same leaders. So we've got Judah right now has thus far followed the same path that Joshua did and done it better than Joshua did. And here it's critical. The other thing to think about, right? And now within the first 10 verses of Judges, we have Jerusalem being conquered by Judah and Hebron, which are both critical cities for the life of David, of the Davidic ruler, because Hebron is where David put his first royal residence before he went and took Mount Zion. So like when David first became king, like Hebron was where he ruled from. So we're seeing Davidic cities, like critical cities of David, being conquered by Judah at the very beginning to further demonstrate Judah's supremacy among the tribes and why. And it keeps reiterating, like, Judah's the right guy to follow. Don't follow the northern tribes. They got Jerusalem. They got Hebron. They're the descendants of David. We got it all. And these three people, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, they're described elsewhere as the Anakim, or as the sons of Anak, the giants. They're not just normal people. Like, these are like Goliath-type characters who were destroyed. And there's so much to say about the Anakim that we're not getting into today. But so not only do they sack cities, but they destroy the giants. The giants that, like, frightened the people of Israel from going into the land of Canaan at the first place, right? And so let's look at 11 through 15 because this continues their journey of victory for the people of Judah. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The names of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him Aksah, my daughter, for a wife." And then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, and he gave him Aksah, his daughter, for a wife. And when she came to him, she urged him to go and ask her father for a field. And when she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" She said, "Give to me a blessing, since you have given me the land, since you have set me in the land of the Negeb, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Now, these words, it's very interesting. They are almost a word-for-word parallel to Joshua chapter 15, verses 13 through 19. Like, if you look at Joshua chapter 15, verses 13 through 19, it says those words exactly. When it talks about, like, the allotment for Judah, including the conversation of Caleb, right? And it talks about how Caleb went against Kiriath Arba, and Caleb drove out Sheshai and Amin and Talmai and the descendants and went to Debir. And so, like, Caleb, what they're doing here is they're aligning Caleb, like the last of the old people. Caleb was the last of the pre-promised land people that are still here, the only one that didn't die in the wilderness, right? The last of the OG. They are aligning Judah with them. And so like this passage is pulled almost directly from Joshua. When Caleb goes and conquers these same places and kills the Anakim, they named them Sheshai, Iman, and Talmai. Those are the names of the giants that were killed by Caleb and Joshua. And it's showing that not only it's tying Judah into the history of Israel, into the Moses history, like Caleb and Joshua. And on top of that, it is setting up Othniel. So Othniel, the man here in Judges 11 through 15, right? The son of Kenaz, he is going to become the first judge of Israel. So we were first introducing him. He is the one, he is a conqueror, he is military victorious, and he is now being established. Like, why is he the first judge? Well, because he is the son-in-law of Caleb, the conqueror of the city of Debir. He is a formidable person. No, it is the
They're cousins, first cousins.
So Othniel is the son of Kenaz, who is Caleb's younger brother. He is Caleb's nephew.
So they're intermarrying and they don't have to worry about genetic screw-ups?
I mean, I don't know why they were able to intermarry and not worry as much about genetic screw-ups, but they did. And for whatever reason, there's a lot of intermarrying that happened back in the day. I'm not advocating it. That's a very long complicated conversation about ethics that we could. Listen, next time we do an Ask the Pastor series, we can talk about incest in the Bible. Okay.
There was a boy or a guy and gal that wanted to get married, and they went to get their marriage license, and they found out that they were half brother and sister.
Oh my.
I mean, this just happened.
Yeah. So like this happened a lot. Like, I mean, Rebecca, Isaac's wife, is a daughter of Abraham's family. Like Laban was,
Related.
yeah, was related to Isaac, and Jacob married his daughters. Like, it just happened then. Yeah, it just was the thing.
I would almost correlate it to probably Amish today, because you're in a quote-unquote tribe or community, and it's just going to happen.
Yeah, really, the idea of marrying second cousins and third cousins and that sort of thing, like, didn't really become a problem until like 150 years ago, and before that, it was just pretty common. But I'm not. Yeah, we're not going to. We're moving away from that. I'm not making any statement about whether that's acceptable or not. I'm merely making a historical statement. So, and then interesting, right? Because then, so we've got Caleb, the last guy from the last of the spies, the unfrightened ones. Like, he's now aligned with Judah. And then we have in verse 16, in the descendants of the Canaanite Moses of the Kenite. Moses' father-in-law went up with the people of Judah from the city of the palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad, and they went and settled with the people. So now we have the descendants of Moses' father-in-law also coming and aligning with Judah. So Judah is the best. That's what we're getting at this point. They conquered better than Joshua did. They've got Caleb aligned with them. They've got Moses' family aligned with them. They're the best. And then we go to verse 17. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction. Man, that's a fancy way of saying they annihilated it. Like, I've devoted this to destruction. Yeah. So the name of the city was called Hormath. And so this is interesting too, right? The reason it was so devoted to destruction is because Hormath was the first place where Israel was defeated when they went and engaged in the Exodus battles, right? In Numbers chapter 14, Israel was defeated there when they fought against the people of Hormath. And Judah is making complete victory over the city. So it's kind of a reversing of the first shame that they had in military defeat during the Exodus. And the fact that Simeon is having victory in Simeon's territory is implying and indicating the favor that a tribe receives when they align with Judah, right? Because we've said that the purpose, or one of the main purposes of this book, is to show the tribes that, hey, we need to align with the line of Judah, whether that's under David or under Rehoboam, not under the northern tribe kingship of Saul's descendants or Jeroboam. So the commentary I have here, right, it says that Judah has prepared a way for David by making the first inroads into Jerusalem, killing the fabled and fearful leaders of Hebron with the giants, the Anakim, incorporating the Mosaic family into its midst, incorporating Hormath into Judean territory, and capturing the Philistines, and thus preparing the way for David's final capture of them, and doing everything possible with God's presence. So now we look at verses 18 and through 20. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out of them the 3 sons of Anak. So those are the 3 sons, Shemai, Ahim, and Almai, which are also referenced in Joshua chapter 15. And so the commentary I have says the editor of Judges assumes, or the compiler of Judges assumes, that Judah, the tribe of David, led the way in establishing a beachhead against Israel's strongest opponents, the Philistines. Right, by Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza were 3 of the cities of the Philistines, with Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza. I can't remember. I can't believe I don't remember the other 2. There's 2 other cities of the Philistines. But the main enemy in the time of David's life is the Philistines, and like they're making the beachhead. They're establishing the initial success. And Judah's unique success as compared with the other tribes has one explanation: Yahweh was present. They were with Judah. God was with Judah, allowing Judah to take possession of the hill country from its original inhabitants, which could not have been done previously. The Judites faced a fabulous opportunity to complete Joshua's task and conquer the land that remained in Joshua 13. Instead, they quit before the job was done. Like, Joshua didn't conquer the whole promised land, and Judah was set up to do that, but they quit. Either they became satisfied with controlling the southern region, or they lost their courage and faith and refused to go further afield to complete God's command and conquer the land. They apparently let human evidence, right, the presence of iron chariots, prevent them from experiencing more divine miracles. Thus, Israel must wait until the Judite king David before they can accomplish the task. Ultimately, the fulfillment of conquering the promised lands doesn't happen until the time of David. So even though Judah, being the golden child, they still did not come to the fullness of their potential. It was only under David that happened. Verse 21. But the people of Benjamin, right? So Judah's the good guys, but the people of Benjamin, the tribe of Saul and one of the northern tribes, did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. So something we have to understand when we read the "to this day" in these texts, right? Because I'm reading that right now in 2022, and that is no longer an accurate statement. Right? Jebusites don't live in Jerusalem right now. Jebusites haven't existed for 3,000 years. But we see this a lot throughout these historical books of the Bible. And so the way to understand that is at the time of the writing of the book, but that even becomes a little complicated. It could be at the time of this account in this book. Because we said, right, that like the book of Judges is a series of different accounts of for lack of a better term, stories about different judges and different time periods and oral tradition. And so when the story of Gideon, when they're talking about, for instance, Gideon, if they say "to this day," could only refer to the time of Gideon, not necessarily to the time that the book was ultimately compiled a couple hundred years later. So I don't know what that means, right? Because ultimately David goes and destroys the city, which leads us to, that helps strengthen or drives out the Jebusites from Mount Zion. That's one of the things David does. Like, he leads his soldiers. It's somewhere in, I think, late 1 Samuel. I don't remember exactly where, but David leads soldiers against Mount Zion and drives the Jebusites out finally. And so that would indicate that this is potentially written, like this would lead us more toward the writing at the time of the David-Saul split. Especially because the first tribe compared to Judah is Benjamin, which is the tribe of Saul. So yeah, Judah the golden child versus Saul, Benjamin, the failed tribe of Saul. We're going to actually do 22 through 36. This is kind of the whole last part of the book, right? Of the chapter. And it's really about their failure. And it talks about all of the northern tribes and basically how they didn't live up to what they were supposed to do. How they didn't actually conquer what they're supposed to do, how they basically failed. So we have Benjamin, the tribe of Saul, and then we have the tribes of Joseph, namely Ephraim, which was the leader of the northern kingdom, and Jeroboam. And so at the house of David, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them, and the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. And now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into your city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city. And they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city, and it is called Luz, and that is the name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tonic, and I don't know how to pronounce a lot of these words, so just bear with me. And its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and the villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo, or the villages of and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in the land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, or Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Aleb, or of Akzib, or of Helba, or of Aphek, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Aneth. So they lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Aneth became subject and forced labor for them. The Amorites passed the people of Dan back to the hill country, for they did not press the people of Dan back to the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted, dwelling in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbim. But the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Arakbim, from Selah and upward. So that's a whole lot of stuff, but basically they didn't do their job. That's what we got to, right? And this sets the stage for everything, right? Because if we remember, in the overall location in the Jewish Bible, right, you have the law, followed by the former prophets, which this is one of them, listing how Israel failed to keep the law. And then the prophets telling you the consequences of the law and God's message. And that's what happens here. The Canaanites are still here, which is ultimately what leads to and lays the foundation for like cultic worship in Israel. This is what lays the foundation for the Baals and Asherahs that come, that we spent a ton of time talking about. Like, you hear places like Dan and Bethel, like cities that became sites of cultic worship under Ephraim in the northern kingdom, and under Rehoboam, and ultimately they just don't do their job. And it really pits like a north-south issue, right? So some comments that we have is that the story of the northern tribes, the house of Joseph takes an entirely different path. Yahweh was with the house of Joseph as well as the house of Judah, but Joseph did not execute or drive out enemy citizens. Rather, Joseph made treaties with them in covenant faithfulness and allowed them to reestablish themselves in Hittite or Syrian territory, from which they would come opposition for David and Solomon. Right? The peace that was won, or the treaties they made with these people, allowed them to go and regroup, and generations later would wage war against Israel. The first priority for the house of Joseph was gaining Bethel, which ultimately became the site of Jeroboam's heretical sanctuary. This one where the golden calves was placed was at Bethel. Judges 1 sets the stage for, the period of the Judges, which is Judges chapter 3 through Judges chapter 16, with its continued attempts to control the land and its continued temptation to be like the nations they lived with. And then 2, Judges 1 sets the stage for the total breakdown of the Israelite coalition, revealing the need for a king, which is Judges 17 through 21. So this chapter is establishing, 1, all of the problems that they're going to face in the periods of Judges because they didn't actually destroy all the enemies. 2, the total breakdown of the Israelite coalition and the peace that was supposed to be had and the unification among them, which results in the need for a king. 3, it sets the stage for the disputes between Judah and Benjamin in the persons of David and Saul. 4, it sets the stage for the establishment of the Davidic monarchy, first at Hebron and then in Jerusalem through victory of the Philistines. And then 5, it establishes, Judges 1 sets the stage for the division of the monarchy because of the cruel policies implemented by Solomon but carried out in the house of David by Jeroboam. And then 6, it sets the stages for the unending dispute over the proper worship places between Jerusalem in the south and Bethel and Dan in the north. So, we can talk about the author of Judges who's intentionally making these points. Like all of those things are intentional points that are being made and highlighted by the Judges author to convey the need for right alignment under the king of Judah. But also the reality is that these events still happened. Like he didn't make these events up. So while the highlighted emphasis of this chapter is pushing this narrative of, hey guys, the north has failed you repeatedly and they have not had God with them. And this goes all the way back to the time of the Judges. Like that's the point that this author is trying to convince us of and doing so well, right? But he's using the reality of what occurred. Like he didn't make up events to try and prove this point. These are really things that happened. So that brings us to Judges chapter 2. Like that is the stage that's been set, right? And next week we'll get into Israel chapter 2, which begins with the breaking of the covenant, right? That we had the covenant reaffirmed at the end of Joshua. They reaffirmed the covenant, and everyone's like, "Yep, we're good." Judges chapter 2, they've already broken it. They're like, "Nope, we're done." And then we'll get into why God raises up the judges. And so we'll look at, probably next week, we'll look at Judges, we'll look at the first 3 judges. So we'll look at Israel's disobedience, the judges of Othniel, Ehud, and Shagmar. But yeah.
So what we just saw in all these battles and all these different cities, won and lost, how much of that territory is this covering? Just the very bottom southern? Or?
No, so this covers most of the promised land of Israel, right? Because these are talks about all of the tribes, and in most cases they conquer, but they don't destroy. And they were told to destroy. And there's interesting questions as to, well, why would God have Israel? Why would a loving God have Israel destroy innocent people? And that's a great question. And we're gonna go down an interesting road. I wasn't thinking about this today, but we will. Ultimately, I don't have the right answer. There's a lot of scholars out there who have opined many things. But one of the things that Jewish tradition tells us, so in Judaism, and we talked about this a little bit last week. We talked about some of the other books that exist in Jewish tradition, and one of them is the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees is a expanded description of Genesis, and it fills in a lot of details. It's where we get the idea that Cain used a rock to kill Abel, because Genesis doesn't say that. The Book of Jubilees says that. And one of the things that the Book of Jubilees talks about is Canaan. Canaan is a son of, maybe it's a grandson of Cain. No, of Ham. Oh yeah, Noah's son Ham, right? Noah curses Ham because Ham uncovers his nakedness. And he curses Canaan specifically. And so the belief of like the Book of Jubilees is that the land of Canaan that Canaan took over was actually land that had been designated already for the descendants of Shem, the people of Israel. But Canaan, the descendant of Ham, said, no, I am taking this land. So Canaan and his descendants, the Canaanites, by existence, according to the Book of Jubilees, were oath breakers. They were people who violated the law of God and the promise of land, because inheritance laws in this time were so dynamic and important. And the argument, or an argument out of Jewish tradition, is that they're not innocent people. They are the descendants of those who illegally broke God's inheritance for the people of Shem. And so the descendants of Shem, specifically Abraham, who were the promised recipients of that land, had to go and take their inheritance that had been stolen from them. So we can do, that's one interpretation of it, and that's based on writings from the Book of Jubilees and other sources, and that's where Jewish tradition comes from. There's a lot more to be said about that. And I'm not fully prepared to have that discussion right now, but interesting fun fact, tidbit that kind of helps, maybe an interpretation to help shape this. But the belief being that like this was always meant to be Israel's, and Canaan took it inappropriately. And therefore, like this was God enacting judgment upon Canaan for breaking of the covenantal oath, right, with Noah. So yeah, Judges chapter 1. This was the easy part. Judges 17, man, it's going to get really real. But it's going to get even more real before then. And there's some, we'll get there. There's a lot of really difficult questions about God that we have to ask. Not bad questions, but difficult. And we have to wrestle with some things. So let's pray. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for what you've revealed to us in your word, and how you inspired your writers and authors and editors and compilers to present your word faithfully and true. God, we thank you for your faithfulness and how you care for your people and for us. Be with us as we depart, until we gather again. We just pray that you bless us and keep us, Lord, and we commit our time to you, Lord, in your holy precious name. Amen. Go with